Okay, so let's get started. Looks like most of you made it back. That's a good sign. It's 8:30. I put up the lecture slides on Moodle. It took a couple of attempts to make the course site visible. It was there, but it was invisible, so none of you could see it, but now you should all see it. You should also see the first homework, which is really just saying that you read the collaboration policy or the academic honesty policy and you agree to. Okay, that's all you need to do. But you will have to turn that in. Okay, so don't forget to do that. So I put that up. Tomorrow there is going to be a discussion section. Okay, and lab 0, which is really a warm-up lab. It's going to be mandatory to turn in, but won't count towards your final grade. Okay, that's going to be handed out tomorrow. Just to get us all started on C++ essentially. Okay, the real lab is a couple of weeks out. Don't worry about that. Okay, so I'm going to do a quick recap of what we did last time, and then today we are going to do a refresher on computer architecture, just so that we are all on the same page before we start the first real lecture on operating system. Okay, so last time I gave a very broad brush introduction to what are operating systems. Okay, so I put up that picture there, which essentially illustrates that the OS is really the software layer that sits between the underlying hardware and end users and applications. Okay, so it's a piece of system software that sits between the two. What the OS also does is it takes the physical machine, okay, and provides an easier to use logical or virtual machine abstraction to end users. So end users don't see a lot of the details of the underlying hardware. They are hidden from the users and applications, and you get easier to use abstraction. The example I gave last time was you take the hard disk on your machine. Okay, that's the physical device. But what is actually exposed to end users are abstractions of a file system, files, folders, and so on. So you don't actually have to deal with the underlying details of managing storage blocks and so on. OS does that for you. Okay? So I also presented a quick history lesson to show how operating systems have evolved over the decades. Okay, just as technology has evolved very quickly, so have operating systems to deal with ever-changing hardware, form factors, and so on and so forth. Okay, so I promised last time I would come back and tell you a little bit about TA office hours and so on, so we have all of that set now. TA is going to be Brendan Murphy, as I announced last time. There's a picture of him here. You will see him at the first discussion lecture class tomorrow. He will also have office hours in addition to me. His office hours are on Mondays and Fridays. Okay, from Mondays 1:15 to 2:15, Fridays 2:30 to 3:30. It's going to be in the CS building in room 207. I'm going to post all this on the course webpage and Moodle and so on, so you don't have to worry about it. Okay, but I just wanted to mention that there. His email address is right there. I will post the slides and also all of this contact information. Okay? So if you have any questions about the course, you can come see me during my office hours. You can go talk to Brendan during his office hours. Same thing with the lab assignments. Okay? So what we will do today is look at very quickly OS functionalities, essentially a recap again of what we had already looked at last time. And for the rest of the class, I'm going to do a quick refresher on computer architecture concepts. Okay, everything you should know in order for you to understand and appreciate what operating systems do. Okay? Some or most of those concepts would have been covered in 230, I presume. I don't know that every single detail has been covered, but a lot of those concepts should have been covered. And if not, this is where you will actually know what they are. The textbook has an entire chapter on the same material. Okay, so that's where what's coming. So very quickly, I talked about this last time as well. Modern operating system provide numerous services or functionality that have to do with managing the CPU, and this is done by providing abstractions of processes and threads. That's going to be the first big subtopic of the course starting next class. Okay? In that context, we'll also look at concurrency and threading. Okay? We'll look at how you can have processes that execute either in parallel or concurrently, how threads can execute in parallel or concurrently, what techniques are used to manage concurrent processes or threads that will lead us to this topic of synchronization, okay, where we will look at locking, locks, semaphores, monitors, all of the concepts that you need to know to write correct concurrent code. Okay, so that's basically going to be the first big topic. We'll talk about I/O devices, which is how CPU and I/O devices can work with one another using the operating system as the intermediary. Okay. In that context, we'll look at device drivers and so on. What are device drivers? How do they allow access to the underlying I/O device that it's managing and so on. So that's another big topic in the course. We'll talk about memory management as well. Okay, so that's another resource on your hardware that we'll look at today, and how the operating system manages memory. Okay, how is memory allocated to processes? How can you allocate, deallocate memory efficiently? Okay. Files we will study in the context of I/O devices. Okay, so we will look at this hard disk as an example of a key I/O device. We will look at how the OS manages it, how it provides this abstraction of files and folders and so on. Okay, how does all of that work? Okay. And the last topic towards the very end, this is going to be in November, is going to be on networking and distributed system. Okay, that's the last piece of hardware on your machine. All of your networking cards, whether it's a Wi-Fi card or an Ethernet card. Okay. How does the OS manage that I/O device? How do you actually take machines and network them? What OS concepts can you use in that context? That is where we are going to look at this notion of a remote procedure call, or in the context of Java, it's called remote method invocation or RMI. Okay. So that's going to be the very last topic. But as you see, as we go through these OS topics, in each of these topics, we have to look at the underlying hardware on the machine and how the OS manages that hardware. When we talk about processes and threads, we have to think about the CPU. When we talk about memory management, we have to think about the RAM on your machine and caches. When we talk about I/O devices, you have to think of any number of the I/O devices. And when we talk about networking and operating system, you have to think about the network card. So what we'll do today is look at the hardware side of things as a refresher, and then we'll go through each of these topics over the course of this semester and then look at them in depth. Okay. So this is again a summary of what we talked about last time. OS is a resource coordinator on your machine. It allows multiple applications access to the underlying resources or hardware. Okay, we talked about the OS as a complex software system and how OS design has as much to do with software engineering as it has to do with performance engineering, okay, and efficiency. And we talked about the history lesson last time and how operating systems have evolved over the decades. Okay, so with that, let me start with this refresher I've been mentioning. Okay, so what this slide shows you is a picture of what is inside a typical desktop PC. That's the picture of the logic board, or what's referred to as a motherboard on a PC. Okay, and that is where all of the hardware components sit. Okay, we don't have to go into a lot of the details there. This is a cartoon depiction of whatever is shown in that photo there. So that's your CPU. This is, or these banks are your RAM, where the memory on your machine sits. And you will see that there is input and output devices. All your Ethernet ports and USB ports are at the top there. There are extension slots and so on and so forth. Okay? So that's a pictorial depiction of what is inside a machine. What is shown in the bottom right corner here is actually a picture of what's inside a laptop. Okay? In this case, it's actually a MacBook. You'll see that much of the space is taken by the battery. Okay? All of these black things are actually a battery, and the entire motherboard is this tiny thing at the top. Okay? So when you look at mobile devices, a lot of the space is actually covered by a gigantic battery, and then the rest of it is all of those components shrunk down to a much smaller form factor. Okay. Now let's go and look at each of those pieces in a little more detail. Any questions on this? Anyone opened a machine before? Looked inside? Yes, some of you have. Okay, so here is a slightly simplified depiction of what I showed on the previous slide. So from our perspective, the key components that we are going to worry about are shown here. Okay? So there is the CPU. Yeah, there is I/O controllers. We see a disk controller, a USB controller. There's a graphics card, which is a graphics controller, and then we see I/O devices. You see your memory here. Yeah, that's your main memory or RAM, and you see some other devices like network cards. Okay, and what is connecting all of them is this interconnect called the system bus. Okay. So you know what? So let's talk about each of these. And the CPU is the processor on your machine. Okay, so the CPU can have one or more cores. For much of this class, we are going to assume a single core CPU for simplicity. Okay, operating systems clearly have to deal with multi-core machines, but a lot of the techniques we will study become more complex when we talk about multi-core, managing multiple. So by default, we'll always assume you have one core on your machine. And occasionally I will talk about how you can extend a certain policy to manage multiple cores. Okay? So that's the CPU. And I/O devices you probably have dealt with in various shapes and forms. Everything that connects to your machine is typically an I/O device. There are I/O devices inside the machine as well. Printer is an I/O device, a monitor is an I/O device, any USB thing you plug into your machine is an I/O device of sort and so on. Keyboard, mice, I/O devices. A network card, which typically is inside the machine, is also an I/O device. So as you can imagine, there are a number of I/O devices that connect to your machine. Okay? An operating system has to manage all of them. Okay? What we will look at when we come to I/O management is what is common and what is different about different I/O devices, and how can the OS manage all of these different I/O devices in some reasonably unified fashion. Okay? The third big component is memory. Okay? Typically, this means the RAM on your machine, but there are, as we will see subsequently, there are different types of memory on the machine. When we mean memory, we typically mean the RAM or main memory. Okay? Now, so that is where all of your code and data is going to reside. Okay? And that code and data, the code is going to be executed by the CPU. When you execute code, you're going to read or write to data in memory, and possibly also read and write data to disk. So the main memory is where all your active processes reside, okay, when they execute. Okay? And the system bus is the communication medium between all of them. Okay, if the CPU needs to access memory, it is going to use the system bus to access a certain address in memory. If the CPU needs to access data on a disk, it's going to use the system bus again to do that. Okay? So the system bus also has to arbitrate concurrent access to different devices. If there are multiple cores there, okay, that's only showing you one CPU and one core. But if there are multiple cores, processes execute in parallel. So if process A and process B have to access two different regions of memory at the same time, the system bus has to decide in what order they are going to access. Okay? Because you cannot do this at the same time. You can only access one thing at once. The system bus is a shared medium, so only one access can happen at any given time. Okay, so it's going to also arbitrate I/O, not I/O, but rather communication between components that it connect to. Okay, so that's an example of how the system bus works. There are many kinds of buses. You must have heard of PCI bus, which is an extension of what is a system bus. System bus is the main interconnect in your machine. There are additional buses that are designed specifically for I/O devices. PCI is an example of it. If you haven't heard of PCI, don't worry about it. When we come to I/O management, we will talk about it in more detail. Okay? So that's a very general picture of computer architecture, okay, what's inside a machine. There are lots of components we have left out here, but those are the 4 key things you should keep in mind. Any questions on this? Yes?
Yeah, not multi-core computers, are there multiple system buses?
Okay, question is, the multi-core computers, are there multiple system buses? There's only going to be one system bus. Okay? So you will just have 2 cores that connect to the system bus. And you will still have the memory bank and so on. So you will not have an additional bus. You just use the same bus to communicate with all of the other components. Any other questions? Yes?
The core is actually where the processing takes place.
Yes, the cores are basically equivalent to what we call a CPU. So that's equivalent to a processor. That's where you execute your instructions, assembly instructions, all the processing is actually taking place on the cores. In this case, you have only one CPU and hence only one core. So this is a uniprocessor, single core system. Okay, but that's where all of the code is executing. The data and the code actually resides in main memory. It's executed on the CPU. Okay. Any other questions? Yes.
Here, disks refers to the hard drive, right?
Yes. So disks are hard disks in this case. Yes. And there are different kinds of hard disks. So now you have what are called SSDs, which are the newer kinds of hard disks. We will also look at the more traditional ones, which are called magnetic disks that spin. And depending on the kind of hard disk you have to manage them. But here we will call it's a generically a hard disk. We don't care about what kind of hard disk it is. It's where all of your files are stored. Okay. Hard disk obviously different from memory. Okay. Hard disk is a persistent storage device. Anything in memory is volatile, which means if you turn off your machine, anything in memory is lost. Okay. But anything you stored on disk is going to stay there. Any other questions on this? Okay, so now let's go into a little more detail into some of these things. So what this slide is showing you is several OS features that we will look at in more depth later on. But what the slide illustrates is what kind of hardware support does the OS need in order to even implement some of these features. Okay? So many features that you see in a typical machine are necessitated by what an OS needs to do. Okay? OS has to carry out certain tasks, and its tasks become simpler if the hardware provides some support for those tasks. Okay, and there are several of these features that have been put in place simply to help the OS do its job better. Okay, and so the services, there are many such services. We'll talk about them in a little more detail here. So let's take this service called protection. Okay, what protection essentially means is that you're taking one process or one application and protecting it from other processes. So one process cannot harm another process, say by accessing its memory and corrupting it. Yeah, that would be bad. If you let a process go and override some other process's memory, it shouldn't be able to do that. Okay? Now, question is, what can the OS do to implement protection? Okay, it's the OS's job to prevent that from happening. If an application tries to access some other application's memory address, it should not let it, saying that you do not have access to it. Okay, so the kinds of hardware support that it uses to implement them are user and kernel mode. We'll talk about that in just a moment. Okay, and base and limit registers, which basically prevent its sandbox that application's memory and prevent it from accessing some other application's memory or other processes' memory. So those are some hardware features, and we'll talk about what those are in just a moment. Okay. So to implement what are called interrupts, okay, there are things called interrupt vectors. To implement system calls, we have something called trap vectors. To implement I/O management, you have interrupts and memory mapping. To implement scheduling and accounting, you have a timer on your hardware. To do synchronization, we have atomic instructions. And to do virtual memory, we have TLBs or translation look-aside buffers. Okay, so many of these concepts are probably new. So we are going to go through some of them, okay, in the next several slides. But what you should realize here is some of these hardware features exist so that the operating system can implement higher level services for end users and applications. Okay, so let's look at each of those row in turn. We'll start with protection. Yeah, so here is basically the more detailed explanation. So let's assume you have a CPU. It supports some assembly instructions. I presume you know what an assembly instruction is. Typically, when you write your code, you write it in a higher level language such as C, C++, Java, Python, whatever your favorite programming languages. But when it executes on the CPU, it has to be translated to a lower level instruction, which is essentially an assembly instruction. Okay? So the assembly instruction is the language that your CPU is going to speak. Yeah, there are some example instructions here which show moving memory address location, what is in the memory address into a register, run the add instruction, and so on and so forth. Here is an halt instruction. Okay, halt instruction halts the machine. Okay, that's an assembly instruction. Okay. So typical CPU will have a set of instructions that it understands. Those are referred to as assembly instructions. Now, as you will imagine, when you look at some of these instructions, you will see that some of them, if they are not used properly, can do more harm than others. Okay? Think of the halt instruction. If you let a typical application execute halt, then it can simply just stop the machine. Okay? maybe maliciously, maybe inadvertently. Okay, you don't want to give arbitrary applications access to such an instruction, which we will call a privileged instruction. Okay? Same thing with I/O or interrupts. Okay, typically, you don't want to give applications direct access to an underlying hard disk, because in that case, it can go and read whatever files are present on, or whatever data is present on it, and not just files that it has permissions to access. Okay? Again, that would be bad. So some of these instructions you cannot allow untrusted applications to execute. So they are referred to as sensitive or privileged. Other instructions you can let an application access. So adding two numbers, okay? You can't do much harm with that. Moving something into a register, okay? Those are all things that applications would have to do to execute code. Okay? So some instructions are privileged or sensitive and others are not. Okay, the question is, how do you ensure that untrusted applications cannot do harm, either maliciously or inadvertently? And that is what an operating system is designed to do. It implements this notion called protection to prevent that from happening. Okay, there are many ways to implement protection. Okay. One way is, or one technique is what is referred to as having a kernel or a user mode. Okay. So typically, in this case, what is going to happen is that the CPU has two modes of operation. What is called a user mode and what is called a kernel mode. Okay? In the kernel mode, any assembly instruction can be executed, whether it is privileged or non-privileged. In a user mode, only instructions that are not privileged can be executed. Okay? So typically, when a normal application runs, the CPU will be executing in user mode. Okay? And when the operating system kernel runs, the CPU will be executing in kernel mode. Okay? So what that also means is when a normal application runs, if it tries to execute any sensitive instruction, because the mode is set in a way that prevents that from happening, it will not be allowed to do. The CPU will throw an error saying you're trying to do something for which you do not have rights to. Okay? But when the OS runs, OS is our trusted piece of software, so the OS can do anything it wants. So whenever the kernel is actually executing on the CPU, the mode bit is set to kernel mode, so that it can do all of those instructions. It can halt the machine if it wants to. It can throw interrupts. It can access I/O devices and so on and so forth. Okay? So one simple way to implement protection is to implement these modes. Okay, so basically that's simply a status bit. Okay, if the status bit is set to 0, let's say you are in kernel mode. If the bit is set to 1, you are in user mode. Okay, so whenever applications run, the bit is set to 1, and the kernel runs, it's reset to 0. Next question.
Is it possible for application to set the status bit to 0?
Okay, that's a good question. The question is, can an application fiddle with the bits and change it? Okay. That would be bad, clearly, because you start in user mode and the application flips the bit, now it suddenly sets your CPU to kernel mode, and it can do whatever it wants. So typically, changing the bit is also a privileged operation that an application shouldn't be able to do. Only the OS should be able to do, or the underlying hardware should be able to do. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. So most CPUs will at least support these two modes, which are called user mode and kernel mode. Most modern CPUs actually have multiple levels, not just two. Okay? And that is what is shown in this picture here, which is called protection rings. So in that, the way that concept maps here is, if you are in ring 0 or level 0, you are in kernel mode. Everything goes, and you can do whatever you want. Okay, if you are in the outermost ring, which is the green one, you are in the least privileged mode. Only certain restricted things can happen, but lots of things are not allowed in that mode. Okay, and there are intermediate ones where you get more and more rights. Okay? So typically end users, end applications will run in ring 3, which is the same as user mode. Okay? And the OS kernel will run in ring 0, which is kernel mode. The intermediate rings are used by other things, like if you have virtual machines. They don't have as much privileges as an OS kernel, but they have more privileges than a normal end user application. So they will run in one of the intermediate rings. Okay? So modern processors generalize this concept of user mode and kernel mode, and that allow multiple levels of privileges. But you need at least two for things to work. Okay, so we will not worry about rings, but they are supported in Intel processors and so on. We'll only assume that a generic CPU has at least these two modes, user and kernel mode. Okay, so that's the first concept for protection. And now you can ask the question, if a application wants to do something privileged, but it does not allow direct access to those instructions, how might it actually go about executing those instructions? Okay? So let me give an example. So I said I/O is a privileged operation. Applications are not allowed to do I/O directly. Okay? But as you can imagine, many applications actually do I/O. You've written programs that read or write files. Those are I/O instructions. Okay? So now let's say an application wants to write a file. Now, writing a file is I/O and it's privileged from our perspective. So, the application is not allowed to actually write a file. So, how does that work? Okay, how does it actually manage to write files? So, the way it works is you have to actually ask the OS to do that operation for you. You are not going to be you, meaning the end application is not allowed to do I/O directly. But whenever it wants to read or write file, it tells the OS, do this for me. And the OS is then going to go and check that it's the right thing to do and then execute that task on the behalf of the application. Okay? So the concept that is used to do that is what is called a system call. Okay? System call is simply a function that you call into the operating system and ask the operating system to execute some privileged operation on behalf of an application, because the application doesn't hold the rights to implement it directly. And the way it will work is actually shown in this picture at the very bottom here. Okay, so you have a user process that's executing at some point. Let's say it wants to read or write a file. Okay, it will basically make a system call. Okay, and that system call will then cause that process to be suspended temporarily. You will switch to executing the OS kernel. Okay, then you will, as you can see, the mode bit will be reset so that now the OS will execute in kernel mode. It will execute the system call, in this case reading or writing the desired data from disk that the application wanted to. It will perform those operations. Once that operation finishes, then you will return back to the process that invoked the system call. That process will start executing or resume executing again, and it will be given the data that it requested, or it will be told that the write completed successfully. Okay. So whenever you actually read or write files, underneath this is what's happening. Okay. Now typically when you write your application, haven't actually directly invoked any system call. You may be doing read, write, change, scanf, or if you write Java, you use some Java libraries. So what is happening underneath is your JVM or your C library, when you have printfs or scanfs or any Java call that do I/O, is internally invoking the system call on your behalf. Okay, you don't actually write applications that directly make these calls. The libraries that you link to your application on the JVM that your code runs on, when you try to read or write files, is actually doing this. It's invoking a system call, it's making the OS do the work, and then you get the data or you request it. Okay, is that clear? So there's one more concept that I didn't mention here, which is how system calls are invoked. So whenever you invoke this special function called a system call, internally it's going to cause what's called a trap or an interrupt. Okay? For most purposes, a trap and an interrupt is the same thing. So when that trap is invoked, what happens is it causes that hardware suspends execution of the process. It saves its state. Okay? And it basically causes the kernel to start executing. Okay, that's how the kernel actually takes over. The system call triggers a trap or an interrupt. The interrupt basically causes the OS to start executing or the kernel to start executing. And the trap also resets this mode bit so that when the kernel executes, you are in kernel mode in this case. Okay. And so that will cause the system call to execute, and then once you are done with the system call, your trap execution is finished, you are going to return back to the process. Okay. So this is where you also need the hardware support for interrupts or trap, because that's how system calls are internally implemented. Every time you invoke a system call, it's going to cause an interrupt. The interrupt will suspend the process and start the OS. Yes? Question?
A system call refers to execution another process then take over the CPU and start working as well for the return the system call, or the process never surrenders to the text and it just keeps running.
Okay. The question is, what is executing on the CPU when the let's say process A has invoked a system call? Meaning, let's say it's trying to read or write files, which will internally invoke a system call. What is executing on the CPU? Will some other process execute, because this process has been suspended until the system call finishes? It cannot make progress. Okay, it's basically waiting for the system call. What's actually going to happen? So there are two ways to answer that question. The first is when this process, which is shown in gray, has been suspended, okay, the kernel takes over. The kernel is the entity that's actually executing on the CPU at that point in time. Okay, it's not that the CPU is idle. Okay, the kernel actually has to execute it like any other application. It's just a special application. So it has code it's executing for the system call. Okay, so it is the one that's executing when that process is suspended. But having said that, if the system call requires you to do I/O, let's say you're reading or writing files, I/O can take long periods of time. Okay, you send a request to the disk and you wait for the disk to return that data. Okay, so at that point, the OS will start idling. It has nothing to do with waiting for the results of your I/O operation to complete. Okay? In that case, what can actually happen, or what does happen, is the OS doesn't sit there waiting for the I/O to finish. It will start executing some other process just to keep the CPU busy. Okay? So some other process executes. In the meantime, this gray process is suspended. OS has sent off your request to the disk. It's waiting for the results. The CPU is idle, so it decides to run on some other process. Other processes will run in the meantime, more than one, if the I/O device takes a long time. And when the I/O operation finishes, the kernel will be told that its I/O operation finished. It will resume execution. It will finish executing the system call, return the results, and the gray process will start executing. Okay. Now, if the system call does not require you to do I/O, it's making you do some simple operations, that doesn't have to happen. Gray process suspended, kernel executes, finishes the system call, resumes execution of the gray process. Okay. That's a simple case. You don't have to do something else in the meantime. But if, in many cases, you may have to do long executing system calls, which may require you to wait. In that case, other things will execute on the CPU. Okay. All of this we'll study when we do process scheduling. You don't have to worry about these nuances now. Okay. All you need to understand is this simple picture and how it works. Any other questions? Yes.
Is there any protection for those processes?
Is there anything for protecting the kernel from being corrupted? Okay. So the kernel, just as you have to protect processes from one another, you also have to protect the kernel's memory from other processes. Okay? So you will use the same technique. Okay? Every process will have a region of memory that's allocated to it, and the kernel will also have a region of memory that's allocated to it. Okay? Processes will not be allowed to access any region of memory that's not allocated. Okay? That's how you protect processes from one another. That's how you protect the kernel from other malicious processes. And I haven't shown you how that works. That's coming. That's how memory management, protection in the context of memory management works. Okay. So here are some examples. We are going to come back to system calls in a lecture or two. These are just several examples of what kind of system calls exist. There are literally dozens and dozens of system calls that any operating system supports. Okay. At least maybe 100 or 200 in Linux alone. Okay. So for every type of hardware, you will have a set of system calls. So to manage processes, we'll have system call. There's one called fork, which we are going to come to. Fork allows you to create a new process. Okay. Whenever you start an application, a new application, you double click on an icon that starts up that application. Internally, what has happened is by double clicking on that icon, you invoke the system call called fork, which says create a new process and start running a new application in that process. Okay. That's a system call. And the OS is actually going to set up a new process for you. Okay. And then there are many others there which we will not worry about. Now, file management is another set of system calls. Opening a file, closing a file, reading from a file, writing from a file, moving the file pointer. All of those are actually system calls. Okay. You all have equivalent operations for these within a language, but internally they will all invoke this underlying system call. These are all Unix system calls. Okay? And there are, if you, depending on the OS, you'll have other similar ones in other platforms. So these are similar system calls in Windows. Okay? You will see that in Unix, what is called fork is called create process in Win32. Okay? And so on. Yes, you have a question there.
On the previous slide, there's something referencing the core imaging process.
Which one?
Right. S equals exec.
Yeah.
That's a core image.
Yeah, so that's called an exec system call. We are going to come to fork and exec in a slide, in a lecture or two, slide or two. So what fork does is it starts a new process. What exec does is it tells the OS that within that new process I want to execute this application. So think of fork as creating a blank process, not a blank process, it just creates a process, but then you tell the OS what you want to execute in there. That's done using exec. So that's basically the concept. When we come to system calls again, you'll actually see some sample code that shows you how to use fork in exec. And you'll actually do some lab assignments that will ask you to use it in some real code. But that's what the concept of an exec. Exec just means execute. It's a short for execute. Okay, so you have to give the name of the application in name here. Okay, so if you say you want to run Chrome, it will be /bin/Chrome is what's given there, and that will cause that process to execute that. That's all it does.
What's the core image?
Oh, what is the core image? Okay, so core essentially says core is a term for memory. Okay, so that basically says load the application from disk into that memory region. That's what core. That's all it's saying. The fancy way of saying load that application into the memory of that process. Okay, so I was mentioning equivalent calls in Windows. So for everything you see in Unix, there is an equivalent call in Windows and any other platform. So you will see that read is called read file. That's the equivalent name of the system call in Win32. For write, there is write file and so on and so forth. So for fork, there is create process. For that exec that we just talked about, create process in Windows does both of those operations. So every operating system will actually support a set of system calls. That's how applications will interact with the underlying application through system calls. So system calls are also the interface between end applications and the OS. Okay, that's the API that you use to talk to the OS. Okay, so you can think of it as two different things. It's the API exported by the OS, and it's also the set of functions that applications invoke in order to perform privileged operations, and how the OS do those tasks on behalf of the applications. Okay, so now we'll talk about memory protection. That will answer some of the questions that came up. So as I just mentioned, you need to protect applications' memory from other applications so that you don't go and trample or override some memory that belongs to some other process. Same is true of the OS. You want to protect the OS from other user programs, so a user program doesn't want to override some kernel memory. Okay. The way this is implemented is through memory protection. Okay. What memory protection does is it allocates, as I said, a certain region of RAM to a certain process, and it checks every time that process is accessing some address in memory, it checks whether that address belongs to that process or some other process. Okay, if it doesn't belong to that process, you are not allowed to access that region of memory. Okay. And here is a picture that shows you one way to do it. When we talk about memory management, we look at many more sophisticated approaches. This is a very simple one. Okay, this is RAM. The gray box there is the region of RAM allocated to the OS. Each blue box, okay, is a region of RAM that's allocated to a process. You will see that there are 4 processes called job 1, job 2, job 3, job 4 that are executing. Each of them have been given a region of memory. And what we want to ensure is that any process is only accessing a region of memory allocated to it. In this case, job 2 should only access memory region that belongs to it, not somebody else's memory address. Okay. And the hardware support that you have in place to do that is what are 2 registers called a base register and a limit register. Okay. The base register, as is shown here, points to the starting address of that process. The limit register points to the ending address of the process. So let's say the process is laid out from address 100 to address 200. Right? The base register will have the value 100, the limit register will have value 200. That's the region of memory allocated to that process. So now whenever you execute any assembly instruction and generate a memory address, okay, you are going to do a range check against the base and limit register. The address that process is trying to access must lie between the base and limit. Right? If it falls, if it's out of range, you are going to throw an interrupt saying you are trying to access something that does not belong to you. Okay? So every assembly instruction you have to do this check to ensure that this process is only accessing a region of memory that's allocated. Okay? The simplest scheme to implement this is to have two registers in hardware, the base and limit, and you store the start address in base, the end address in limit, and every time you execute any instruction that accesses any memory region, you are going to do this check internally. That the memory address is between the base and limit. If it's outside, then you are not going to let that instruction execute. Okay. This is a very simple way to protect other processes from the running process, so that you don't go and access some memory region that doesn't belong to you. Okay. So same thing is going to protect a process from accessing the kernel's memory as well, because that's out of range.
Is that check done for every reboot operation, or is it done before the program runs?
Okay, so question, is that check done for every operation or before the program does? This is done dynamically at runtime for every assembly instruction that's executing. Okay. When we come back to memory management, we'll see some hardware that allows you to do these checks efficiently. You need a comparator and an adder to do that. Right now, you don't have to worry about it. So all you're doing is you're going to say, if you have, let's say, move instruction that moves a piece of memory into a register, there's an address there. You'll take that address, you'll check it against this when that instruction executes, not before, when it's executing live in runtime. Some question there. Yes.
So that would mean that every single time a job is queued onto the RAM, you always have you have a set amount of memory that you can allocate to every single job, because you cannot keep changing your register because you don't know which processes memory area you might reach into.
Yes.
So does that mean that every single process has, say, X amount of memory allocated to them?
Okay. So that's a good question. Again, the question is here in the simple picture, what we have shown is a specific amount of RAM that's allocated to a process. Can that change? Okay. And how does it change? So this scheme that is shown here is what is called contiguous memory allocation. Okay. It is the simplest and the most restrictive form of memory allocation. As you will see, in this case, there is no room for any process to grow at all. Okay. If the job 2 needs more memory, it cannot grow because process 3 is laid out right where it ends and process 1 is laid out right before it begins. So there's no region. Okay. But you could implement the scheme so that there are little gaps between processes that allow you to grow some. In that case, the value in the limit register has to be increased to say that the size of the memory has increased. Okay, but that comes with some restriction in that you cannot grow arbitrarily. Okay. And as soon as you use up that region, you are out of line. Okay. So dynamic memory allocation is a big problem when you use contiguous memory allocation. Most operating systems don't use this scheme because of its restriction. Very early operating systems that I talked about last time use this approach. Most operating systems will allow a process to be spread out in RAM. There are little pieces in different pieces, but at this point we don't have to worry about it. Okay, so the answer is, in this case, everything you said is true, but in reality, this is not what the operating system will use because of the restriction that one question is.
I wanted to know how the operating system keeps track of all its registers, like within its own block of memory. Does it have a table?
Okay. Question is, how does the operating system know what is where the base and limit values for each process is? Right? So, as we'll again see shortly, this operating system itself maintains some data structures for each process. Okay, there's a data structure called the process control block, which has one entry for every active process. That entry will tell you what is everything you need to know about the process. Where is it laid out in memory? What's the start and the end register? What was the instruction pointer pointing to before we suspended execution of the process. Okay, all of those values are stored in a data structure that is stored in the kernel's address space. Okay? So when the kernel decides job 2 is going to execute, it first has to load the right base and limit registers for job 2 before it executes. Okay? If it starts executing job 3, it has to look at a data structure, pull out the base and register values and load them in before that job will execute. Okay? Because the base and limit values are specific to a particular process. Every time a process executes, you have to load that first. That's the job of the OS. It has data structures to track it. Okay? When we talk about memory management, we look at all of that, data structures and so on. Any other questions? Okay, so we are done with memory protection. So this is a quick picture that you should know about what a typical process looks like. Okay? Process is not a blob of memory, it has some structures inside it. Okay, so typically a process has what is called segments, and the segments of process do different things. So typical process will have a text segment which contains the code of that process. That's basically the source code that you write that's translated to assembly instructions is stored in the text segment. Okay? There's a stack segment, that's the stack of that process. Okay? You will have a data segment which is your heap. Okay, I assume you heard heap stacks before. Okay? Heaps are where you do dynamic memory allocation. Whenever you run a constructor, do a malloc, depending on your language, you will allocate new memory. Okay? The way that will work is there is basically, as you see, that's a space you allocated to a process. There is a gap in between here, and then this causes the stack grows downwards, the heap grows upwards. Okay? So that also means that in this particular case, where you allocated a fixed amount of memory, there's a limit to how much the stack and the heap grows. Okay? There you can relax this and let them grow arbitrarily, but here this is how it's going to work. Okay? So, but for the purposes of this slide, what you really need to understand is typical process will have at least 3 segments. Okay, part of memory that stores the code of the process, a part of memory that's going to store the heap, which is data, and a part of memory that's going to store the stack, which is also data. Okay. 1 code segment, 2 data segments at a minimum. Okay, typically, we'll have a lot more segments that are libraries and synchronization primitives like locks and other things. Okay, but at least 3. Okay, stack, heap, data, okay, which is referred to as code, data, and stack in this example. Okay? Yes, there's a question there. Question is the heap memory protected with base and limit register. So what we are going to do is treat the entire process as one blob, and we'll put the base register here at the beginning and the limit register at the top. Okay, so everything is protected by one base and one limit. You don't need to have a separate base for each segment. Although there are schemes that will do that as well. Okay, but for now, given what we have learned, assume that there is one base, one limit for the entire process, not for the individual segments.
Sorry, what was the text again?
The text is just code. Okay, I think there are different terminology. Compilers call it the text segment. Is really where the code sits. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about registers. So as I said, there are different kinds of memory on the machine. We talked about RAM, okay, but there are others, there's registers and caches. We'll look at that in a little more detail. So we'll assume that a register is one word piece of memory that's very fast that a process has access to. Typical CPUs will have a set of registers of different kinds. There will be things called general purpose registers that the process can use for any purpose, to store any variable. There are special registers such as a stack pointer and instruction pointer and so on. Okay? So here are the 3 that we care about in addition to general purpose register. Instruction pointer is also called the program counter. That is the register that is going to point to the next instruction in the text segment of the code segment the process is going to execute, or the current instruction. Okay? So it always points to what is executing. Okay? Once that assembly instruction finishes, you point to the next instruction and so on. So that tells the CPU what to execute next. Okay? That's called the program counter. Okay? Stack pointer points to the beginning of the stack, okay? The stack segment, so you know where the stack segment actually ends. And same with the frame pointer points to the end. Okay? So they basically tell you where the stack begins and ends. And there are other such registers for heaps and so on, which we won't worry about. What we really want to worry about are general purpose registers and program counter, which in some architecture is called the instruction pointers. In the textbook it's referred to as the program counter. Okay, that's a register that points to what is the instruction that's executing at this point in time. Okay. Now every time the OS switches to executing some other process, okay, it has to save all of these registers in this data structure called the process control block that I was just mentioning. Because the next time you resume execution of this process, all of those registers have to be restored. Okay, you have to go back to where you left off. Okay, so if you don't save the register, some other process is going to go override those values and they will be lost forever. Okay. So whenever you suspend execution of the process, whether it's to execute a system call or whether you're just switching to a different process, you have to save the registers. Okay, those are saved in kernel address, kernel's memory. Okay, and then when you resume execution, you restore them again. Okay, so memory hierarchy consists as a small animation here. So typically on a machine, you have what is called a memory hierarchy, where your registers are the fastest memory you have on the machine. Okay, but they are simply one word inside. So you don't have, if you have 20 registers, you may have 20 words of memory available to you. Okay? And then you have caches in between that are faster pieces of memory. You may have what is called a level 1 or L1 cache. Yeah, that is somewhat slower than registers, but also bigger. You can store more stuff in the cache. Then there is a L2 cache, which is a level 2 cache. So it is slower than an L1 cache. You may have an L3 cache on some processors. Okay? And then you have RAM, which is your main memory. Okay? And as you go down this hierarchy, the amount of storage you have keeps increasing because memory gets cheaper to implement, but also the speed of memory keeps slowing down. Okay? So let's say registers you can access in one clock cycle. Okay, that's 1 cycle latency. Typically L1 caches in this example is 2 cycles. Okay, it's half as fast as the registers. Okay, L2 cache 7 cycles. RAM is 100 cycles. Okay, so you'll see that accessing something in RAM is 100 times slower in this example than accessing something in registers. Okay, so you keep the most frequently accessed variables in registers so you can get access to them quickly. And other things have to be in RAM. So if you have to go to RAM, you are going to slow down execution some. Okay. Now when you compare that to disk, you will see that disks are 40 million cycles. Okay. So orders of magnitude slower than RAM, roughly 3 to 4 orders of magnitude slower. Okay. If you have to go to disk to fetch something, rather than going to memory, that's going to be slowing you down by another 3 orders of magnitude. Okay. But the amount of disk space you will have will be a lot more than the amount of RAM you have in the machine, which will be a lot more than what you can store in registers. Okay? So this is referred to as the memory hierarchy on a machine, where there is a hierarchy of different kinds of memories or storage devices, and as you go down the hierarchy, you get more space, but you are also that level is also slower than the previous one. Okay? In some cases, significantly so. Next question.
What are the D and I?
What are the what? Oh, the D and I. So let's see. So I think what that is telling you is, depending on the architecture, in some cases the cache may be on chip or it could be separate. So if it says it's separate, so certain caches can be on the chip itself. So access to it. The reason it's faster is you don't have to go far to fetch data. If it is, so you may have a cache that is attached to the core. Okay? So it's very quick to access because it's right adjacent on the same chip. If you have to go off chip, you have to go through some wire to access it. So things slow down. But you can put more because that's a separate chip and so on. Okay, but the cost also increases because now you have to put a separate chip. So it's simply a way to say that how speeds increase, how costs decrease as you lay things out, whether it's on chip, off chip, you have to access it through the system bus and so on. Okay. Okay, so the other thing to keep in mind is registers and memory is explicitly managed by the operating system and the processing. The OS can decide what goes in what region of memory. The application when it runs, the process when it runs, decides what gets stored in the registers and so on. Caches are typically not managed by the OS. They are managed by the hardware for you. They are transparent to both the OS as well as application. Okay, caches are always managed by hardware. It's the same thing I mentioned here is L1 cache is typically on chip, it's small. L2 cache is next to the chip, it's close by and it's larger. L3 cache is pretty large, but it's on the bus, so you have to go on the bus to access it. So things slow down as you go down the hierarchy. But the thing to keep in mind though is, as I mentioned, caches are not explicitly managed by the OS. The OS doesn't decide what goes into a cache. Okay, that's automatically decided by the hardware. Whenever data is being fetched, it looks at what is being accessed, how frequently it's being accessed, and it puts it in the right level. More frequently accessed data items or instructions are put in faster pieces of memory, like an N1 cache or an L2 cache. Less frequently accessed, but still frequently accessed, can lower down the hierarchy. And then whatever is not in the caches is always embedded as part of the processor's memory space. Okay. So the next hardware that feature we are going to look at is traps. As I mentioned, traps are similar to interrupts. I assume you at least heard of the term interrupt before. Okay, so interrupt is a special signal that is generated by the hardware whenever a certain condition occurs. Typically, it may be an error condition or some sort of condition that requires attention. Okay? So whenever you raise an interrupt, you jump into a piece of code called the interrupt service routine, which is the code that is going to allow you to handle that. The traps are a special kind of interrupt which decide. Traps are a special kind of interrupt that allow the OS to handle special conditions. Okay? So example of a trap, as I said, was a system call. Or application makes a system call that generates a special kind of trap that causes the OS to execute the system call. Okay? Trying to write to a read-only piece of memory, also a type of an error condition. It causes the OS to run and maybe terminate the execution of the process or throw an error to the process saying you're trying to write to a read-only region. Okay? You can have page faults, you can have lots of other kinds of traps. Okay? So typically, regardless of what kind of error condition or condition is being raised, this what is shown here is how traps are actually executed. Okay, whenever there is a trap or an interrupt, you have to save the state of the process. Okay, what that means is you take all the registers and you save them into kernel's address space so you can resume execution later if you have to. Okay? So that's the program counter, the stack pointer and so on. And then you transfer control to the kernel and specifically the function or the method in the kernel that's designed to handle that trap. Okay, so if you call a certain system call, you basically go into the part of the kernel that executes that or has code for executing the system call. Okay? And the way this is done, the way you figure out which part of the kernel will execute that system call is you have a table. Okay? That table that's shown there, where your interrupts or traps are numbered 0 through n. For each interrupt or a trap, you store a memory address. That is the starting address of the function that will execute, handle that trap. Okay? That's the trap handler. Okay? So there are these hex values here. Okay? Each hex value is a memory address that says if trap 0 occurs, jump to that region in the kernel, and that's where you have the function that will execute that. Okay? So if you have system call to do certain things, you will index into this table, and then you'll figure out what system call was called, and you'll go to that memory region and execute that system call. Okay? So this is basically how the trap is actually handled. So you jump to the address given in the vector, execute that address, and then on completion, the OS will resume execution of the process. Okay, sometimes it may terminate the process depending on what the process was trying to do. Typically, if you try to access some region of memory that doesn't belong to you, you get what's called a segmentation fault and the process is terminated. Okay? If you make a system call, you still trigger a trap, but your process doesn't terminate. Once the system call finishes, you just resume execution of the process with the results of the system call. Okay? So save the state of the process, okay? Execute the trap, resume execution of the process in most cases, or if the process is terminated, you don't do that step. Okay? That's how traps work. Okay, the hardware feature that we have that enables all of this is the implementation of the trap, which is a special kind of interrupt, the implementation of a trap vector that allows you to quickly figure out which part of the kernel has code to execute that trap, okay, or to handle that trap. Any questions on this? Yes, there's one in the back.
Is the page table maintained by the OS or the hardware?
The
Page table.
The page table. Okay, I haven't even mentioned what a page table is. Page table is maintained by the hardware, but this is not a page table.
No, on page fault, when you have a page fault,
Yes.
in that case it has to be updated.
Okay. So
So-
page fault is a diff. We haven't even come to what a page fault is. So page fault essentially says you access a region of memory that's currently stored on disk. It was not loaded into memory. Okay, that's called a page fault. So that requires you to go fetch that piece of that process from disk and load it into memory, and you update a table called a page table. All of this we'll study when we talk about on-demand memory management. But page tables are data structures that the OS will maintain with support from the underlying hardware. You need hardware support and you need some OS support. Both of those are needed. Okay, but let's not worry about what those are at the moment. Okay, so I already mentioned. So here is a more annotated version of the trap vector, as I said. So this annotates what each trap is. So trap 1 is memory violation, and trap 2 is illegal instruction, trap 3 is system call, and trap 0 is illegal address, and so on. So whenever those conditions occur, you will basically generate that trap ID, and then you'll jump to that region that's pointed to in that table and execute it, that code that tries to handle that error condition. Okay, so for what time we have left, we are going to talk about I/O management a little bit. So as I mentioned, I/O devices are also something that the OS has to manage. Okay? And I'll tell you a little bit about how I/O devices work now, and we'll come back to it and learn about that in more detail. Okay, if you take any I/O device, okay, whether it's a printer or whether it's a USB drive that you plug in or something like this. So the way typically these I/O devices work is that they have a little processor on them, which is different from the main processor of the CPU, typically called a controller. Okay, so it's a controller or a processor that is embedded into the I/O device. Okay, so the I/O device can accept commands from the main CPU, okay, and execute those commands. Commands could be, you can send off a command to a hard disk saying go and read this block of data from this. You can send off a command to the graphics card saying go display some pixels on the screen. Okay. These are all commands that a typical device can support. Okay, so you will have a little processor on each I/O device. That processor will understand some command that a CPU will issue to. Okay, so CPU issues commands and continues. Okay. So since I/O devices are slow, typically when the CPU, in this case by CPU in the OS, issues a command to an I/O device, it's not going to wait for the I/O device to finish. So that would mean idling the CPU for a long period of time. So you simply issue the command and you do something else. That something else could you start executing some other process. Okay. Now when the I/O device is finished executing that command, it will raise an interrupt. Okay. The interrupt will suspend whatever is executing on the CPU at that point in time. Okay. It will jump back to the OS. And the OS will take over and say, okay, the command that was issued has finished. Let's see what happens. What are the results of the I/O command? Okay, so it will take those results, process them, and if some application is issued those I/O commands, it will hand those results back to the application. Okay. So this is typically how I/O devices are going to work. Okay. You will issue commands to the I/O device. The processor on the I/O device will go off, try to execute those commands. Because it's slow, it's going to take a while. The OS will start doing something else in the meantime. Typically, that means executing some other process. And when you're done, interrupts are raised. Yes,
Is an interrupt different from a trap?
good question. So, is an interrupt different from a trap? Typically, they are very similar concepts. Right? There is a slight difference, but for all practical purposes, you can assume that they do the same thing. Right? What happens is typically that one way to distinguish is interrupts are something that hardware generates. There is a condition that hardware generates. Traps are conditions that software generates. Right? If you do a divide by 0, okay, that's an error condition, but your application caused that error condition to occur. If a disk finished execution of IO command, it's a piece of hardware they're generating. That's one way to distinguish between them. But internally, from OS perspective, they're handled the same way. And you basically have, just as there's a trap vector, there's an interrupt vector. Just as there's a trap handler, there's an interrupt handler, and so on. Yeah, so that's the way to think about them. But essentially the same thing. Okay, one is generated by software, one generated by hardware. Okay. So when we again come back to IO management, we'll see that there are 3 ways to execute IO commands by IO devices. They're called synchronous, asynchronous, and memory map. Synchronous communication or synchronous IO essentially means that when the IO command is executing, the process is actually blocked. The process is waiting for the results of the IO command. This is the default mode. When you write your program, okay, let's say to read a file, you issue a read command and you try to read a file, your process is going to wait, okay, until that read command finishes. Okay, it cannot do anything else. It's a single threaded process. Okay, that's called synchronous IO. So that's what is shown in this picture here, where the process actually is issued a command, it's waiting, so that command comes to the device driver, it goes to the interrupt handler, it goes to the hardware executes the command, and then the results come back up at some later point in time. So the x-axis here is time. So while all of that is happening, the process is waiting, it's blocked. Right? This is called synchronous IO. That's by most IO, unless you've done something special to it, is actually by default synchronous. Okay? Here is another way to do it, which is called asynchronous IO. Asynchronous also called non-blocking. Synchronous also is also referred to as blocking IO. As the term non-blocking suggests, you do not block, you do not wait while an IO operation is in process. Okay? So that's also what's shown here. So the requesting process issues an IO instruction in this case. Okay? And the IO instruction basically goes all the way down into the hardware and you get an acknowledgement. The acknowledgement says your IO command has been received and it's being processed. Okay? Once you get this acknowledgement, the process will continue. It will not be blocked in this case. The process will continue and go off to do something else. Okay? That's this process, not some other process. And then at some later point in time when the IO command finishes, the process is interrupted, saying your read for that file has finished and the data is ready. So the interrupt will cause that process to go into a process, interrupt handler in the process that will allow you to take the data from disk if you are reading some data, for example. Okay? This is asynchronous IO. Okay? Unless you have done something special, you will be blocking more. But there are applications that use non-blocking IO for efficiency reasons. If you don't want to block while certain slow operations are in progress, you use non-blocking IO. For to use non-blocking IO, you have to use special versions of calls, IO calls, to read files and write files. Typically, they will have something that says asynchronous reads or asynchronous writes, okay, depending on the language. Okay, so those calls are also available too. Okay. So the third technique is called memory mapped IO. So this is also something that allows you to do things more efficient. Both of the previous ones that I talked about, blocking or non-blocking, okay, typically if you have to read or write small amounts of data, okay, you use blocking or non-blocking. But then for each small piece of data, you have to issue a separate command to the IO device. Okay. Now if you want to write large chunks of data, that can be slow, because you can if you tell the disk, here write 1 byte. This goes off, writes a byte. And you say write another byte, and go off and write another byte. That's a very inefficient way to read or write an entire file. If you try to read 1 byte at a time, where you are basically going to spend a lot of time doing each of these operations one after another. A better way to do it, or a more efficient way to do it, is what is called memory mapped IO, where you tell the IO device, the command you give to the IO device is, I want to read or write a large chunk of data. Here's a region of memory. Okay. If I'm reading, then whenever you start getting data from your device, go and write it, go and store it in this region of memory. When you have written or read the entire chunk, then you let me know that this entire operation has finished. Okay. So now you handed off a much bigger I/O instruction off to the I/O controller, saying read or write this large chunk of memory, and then the process can go off and do something else. And I/O device is directly reading or writing to memory without being told to read or write each individual byte one at a time. Okay? So this is referred to as memory mapped I/O. Okay? This is also an optimization that most hardware will support to allow you to do I/O more efficiently when you're doing lots of it. If you're reading, writing little pieces of data, you can basically do it one byte at a time. But trying to read or write large chunks of data, that's going to be very slow. So you have to use something called memory map. Again, when we come back to I/O devices, we'll look at how the OS is actually going to implement this for us. But for now, all you need to understand is that this I/O controller has support to directly read or write to regions of memory without the CPU telling it to read or write individual bytes. That is a hardware support that we need in order to implement this feature at the OS level. The ability for I/O devices to directly access RAM without going through the CPU. And that's basically what is happening in this case. Okay, so last couple of hardware features before our refresher is going to be done and the class will be done also. Okay, there is also this thing called a timer on most pieces of hardware. Okay, typically your machine is going to have an internal clock that's going to tick once a second. Actually, it takes much more frequently than that, but let's assume it ticks once a second. Okay. You can use that clock to implement what's called a timer operation. Timer operation is exactly what it sounds like. You have a timer, you set a certain time, and when that amount of time has elapsed, an interrupt is raised saying that much time has elapsed. Okay. You can use this for many different things. Okay. One reason you need a timer is to implement what is called process scheduling. If you have some number of processes all active and you want to give each of them a little time on the CPU and have them go in round robin order, you are going to use a timer. Okay, you are going to say process A gets to execute. Okay. You set a timer saying it's going to execute, let's say, for 100 milliseconds. Okay. And then it goes off, process A is executed. When 100 milliseconds are elapsed, this timer is going to go off. Okay, saying your turn is up. And then the OS will run and it will basically save the state of that process and then let the next process. And then it will set another time. And then you are going to let that process execute for some period of time and so on. So CPU scheduling, which we'll talk about at great length, requires hardware support in the form of a timer. Without a timer, there's no way for the CPU or the OS to know how much time has elapsed and when is it time to execute some other process when you are implementing scheduling. That's one reason to have timers. You can have use timers to do accounting and billing. Accounting simply tells you for how much CPU cycles does a process consume. So that's also tracked through timer instructions and so on. So when we talk about synchronization and concurrency and threading, you'll see that you will also need underlying hardware support. Okay, so first let me define what synchronization means. Okay. So whenever you have processes or threads that are executing concurrently and they want to coordinate certain tasks, you need the ability to synchronize them. Okay. You need the ability to coordinate how they do something together. Okay. And that coordination is referred to as synchronization. Okay. So the OS provides some support to synchronize cooperating or concurrent processes. And the way it provides your support is it relies on underlying hardware support to implement synchronization correctly. Okay. There are two ways to do this. Okay. One is for the architecture to allow you to enable or disable interrupts, and the other way is for the architecture to support some special assembly instructions called test and set. Okay. Now the way you implement synchronization is through one of those two mechanisms. Okay, so let's say you want process A to run, and while process A is running, you don't want anything else to interrupt it because it is actually implementing what is referred to as a critical section. Okay, and then the way you will implement this in the underlying OS is you will disable interrupts. So even if a trap occurs, the process is not process is not interrupted. It will get to run until it's finished executing a critical section, at which point the trap that had occurred or the interrupt that had occurred will be handled. Okay? So you can mask or temporarily disable interrupts or trap, and this is a feature we will use for synchronization. You don't understand why it is needed, that's fine. I don't expect you to understand right now. When we talk about implementing locks and semaphores, we are going to again go back to this. Here, all I want you to understand is there are some special hardware features that are present that make the implementation of locking, semaphores, monitors, which is synchronization, easier to implement by the operating system. Okay, the two features are enabling and disabling interrupt, and then there's a special instruction called test and set, which we will come back to again later to see how it is used. Okay, so virtual memory, I already talked about memory management already, and there was this question about page table. Again, when the OS manages memory, it needs special hardware support. We already looked at base and limit register. Okay, that's just one example of hardware support. There are other data structures called page tables that generalize the concept of base and limit registers. All of those you need support and the underlying hardware. Otherwise, it will become much harder for the OS to manage memory, to prevent one process from accessing another process's memory, to dynamically grow and shrink processes as you allocate and deallocate memory. So to perform all of these operations efficiently, you need hardware support. A base and limit register are the simplest form of hardware support. Typically, there will be a lot more in the form of what are called page tables, the form of what are called translation look aside buffers, which are simply caches for page tables. I presume you've heard of TLBs in 230. I told you this. Yes. I will come back to TLBs and caches when we talk about memory management. Okay? But again, this was just a quick refresher for you to understand that there are lots of underlying hardware support that is needed for you to the OS to implement its functionality. Okay? So that is it for today. This was again a very broad brush introduction to hardware features. Now next time we'll start talking about some OS level components. Okay, so